I suspect Fred Pardee himself is glued to a screen, or will be looking at this later on. And so I also want to thank Fred for his support of the center in these kinds of activities and his interest in development issues. This will be a bit of a free-for-all, open thinking, and the more conversation that we have with you and your thoughts, ideas, challenges to any of the ideas that are presented will be most welcome. Some of us have an inherent belief that development in countries really is predicated on the health of the population and the education. And health and education are both related to one another. You can educate to health, to improve behavior, but unhealthy kids can't learn. So there's a very striking connection between all of those. And they are then the drivers of economic development, which is underlying development. And we kind of think that science and health per se are better drivers of development. And for countries that want to engage globally, it's a much better way than dropping bombs. So there's an inherent interaction between science, health, diplomacy, and development. And that's the intersect that we wanted to explore a bit today. And we're very lucky, and we're taking advantage of a visit that had been planned for quite a while with Zulfiqar Bhutta, who's here in the middle. John, Simon, and I have known Zulfi for over 2 decades now. We were involved in some of Zulfi's earlier training and experiences as a researcher in Pakistan. He's a physician from Peshawar and is currently a professor at the Aga Khan University. He just recently stepped down as the chair of the Department of Pediatrics to take on a larger program, which is creating a division that includes both the departments of pediatrics and obstetrics and gynecology. So in our system, a division is part of a department. In the Pakistani system, it's halfway around the world. Departments are part of a division. But what that allows him to do now is to try to integrate a research agenda at the laboratory and the field level that addresses the problems of women and children's health. And those are 2 key populations within a country for development. I think the men can disappear. If we have women and kids, countries will do all right. So Zulfi is here as a distinguished visiting scholar in global health, and we've had great conversations with him. He's been thinking about this issue of health, science, diplomacy, peace, with a particular regional perspective. What can you do in South Asia that would bridge some of the barriers that exist at the borders and the political scene? So we're very happy to have him here. And that led us immediately to ask Harry Barnes to join us. Harry grew up as a professional diplomat and as a stellar representative of our country as an ambassador to 3 different countries, one of which was India in the early 1980s. After leaving the diplomatic service, he served at the Carter Center, just to get it right, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation at the Carter Center. And I met Harry 7 or 8 years ago. I was then the director of the Fogarty International Center at the NIH, and Harry and a colleague who had spent a public health leader who had spent some time in Pakistan at the Aga Khan University, where Zulfi is, and Zulfi, and some friends in India, created a meeting bringing 20 Pakistani scientists from the Pakistan National Research Council and the Indian Medical Research Council to meet to talk about collaborations that would go across the border. Harry was instrumental in putting that meeting together, along with Jack Bryant and Zulfi and a guy named Nirmal Ganguly, who was our distinguished scholar last year. And great discussions, great ideas, and no action afterwards. So big hype, no delivery.
That's a recommendation.
That's a recommendation because although there's been no delivery, he hasn't given up on pushing the idea and the agenda, and that's part of what we've learned is that persistence pays. Ultimately, things work. Now, so that led to the connection to Harry, and then Harry said, "You really have to talk to this lady at the National Academy of Science, Patricia Wrightson, and she's trying to put together some programs to build science collaborations between U.S. and Pakistan in particular, but other parts of the world as well." And so we were very happy to get in touch with Patricia, and she was very gracious to come and join us. And you may want to correct some of the various things that you do at the academies, but my understanding is that she's program director for the Policy and Global Health Affairs Division at the academies, and is particularly involved with the Committee on Scientific Communication and National Security. So again, science, communication, security, development, all tie in together. And then Patricia said, you need to get in touch with a guy over at MIT named Jeff Westcote, who is an interesting guy. He's an architect. He's really interested in architect and health, and he's an expert on Mughal gardens. So he just got back from India. We met with him yesterday and had some fascinating discussions with Jeff. So welcome, MIT. Thanks for coming. So we've kind of divided the territory here into the science, diplomacy, and development, and we'll go in that order, unless you guys decided differently earlier today behind my back. So we'll start off with Zulfi laying some groundwork, Harry adding onto it from his perspective, and then Patricia, and then free for all. Any questions or comments? Okay, let's go. Zulfi.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry, for that very generous introduction, and I'm especially delighted, and thank you, Adil, for laying this program, putting this program together. I'm delighted because this is a great opportunity for a dialogue, and I'm particularly pleased that we haven't got a formal presentation set up, because I think it allows me to say a few things, leave many things unsaid, and a lot of opportunity for discussion. So I wanted to say a word to begin with what my new role at the Aga Khan University and the challenges, which will set a little bit of the scene as to why I am looking at the opportunities around public health science, particularly the area that I work in, maternal child health and nutrition, as an opportunity to transcend boundaries, to try and see if we can look at things beyond our own specific interests, our own national issues, to what are the opportunities here for dialogue, for looking at things in the context of a larger platform which can bring people, civic society, institutions together, and hopefully can also play a role in bringing governments and influencing policies. So my new role at Aga Khan University is to set up a program, an innovative program, which will bring traditional clinical research and outreach programs of maternal health, newborn child health, and development together, so that it all becomes part of one continuum, which it truly is. So traditional, professional, and scholarly boundaries of people doing maternal health within the realm of obstetrics gynecology, people doing child health as pediatricians, and some others doing community development in community health sciences. The university wants to break those boundaries, and not only boundaries within the campus in Pakistan, but I've been formally charged with looking and developing a blueprint which will affect the university's operations in Central Asia, South Asia, and East Africa. So you can well imagine what a huge challenge that is, and I accepted that with a great degree of trepidation. So let me paraphrase what I perceive as a huge challenge and also somewhat of an enigma. Coming from the region that I do, South Asia, a very dynamic region, with parts of it growing at a rate which would tell you probably indicate that there isn't a global economic crisis, a real challenge to even the growth rate of China. Economic indicators which are not really too bad. I mean, we are not Africa. So we've got economies growing until recently at rates of 6 to 8%, per capita incomes which generally exceed $1,000 per capita per year. Yet if you look at the health indicators, particularly for women and children, the indicators are abysmal. So for every 1,000 children born in Pakistan today, over 90 will not live to see their 5th birthday. Some 50 of those will actually die in the first 4 weeks of life, 2/3 within the first few days of life. And this is in the wake of a region which has nuclear technology, which can boast auto manufacture plants, which has science institutions, which has the infrastructure for biotechnology, which can challenge any developing country institution. So this is really a paradox that many people have struggled with. If you take some of the determinants of these kind of indicators, measures of empowerment, gender inequity, undernutrition, you find that many of those determinants also belie overt progress or superficial progress. So to cut a long story short on the indicators, which I don't want to bore you with, the fact is the region has made very little progress. And the region hasn't made progress because there hasn't been the awareness of the importance of good health, sound development, a good experience and exposure in early childhood to future gains and investments. There has been perhaps a recognition of short-term investments for profits and gains in the short term, but not in terms of an intergenerational impact of some of these investments. And you have to ask yourself why. Why hasn't governance, why hasn't a political will understood the importance of making sure that your population isn't impoverished, isn't undernourished, doesn't have the kind of social inequities that plague many other developing countries. Some of these issues are also critically relevant to orphan areas of work. I mean, in talking to Dr. Westcott yesterday, we talked about how urban planning, for example, the whole issue of water security, water sanitation, hygiene, has just simply disappeared from the public health platform. And I say that with a great degree of confidence. 40 years ago, in the curriculum of medical schools, the subject of hygiene, public health planning, how do you train a doctor of today to plan the development of a simple sanitation sewage system in a village, this was very much part of the curriculum. Today it's been completely lost, and as a result we don't have that link between advanced technology, science, and some very fundamental issues. So one has to therefore also look at the issue of is this relevant to some of the challenges that are emerging out of South Asia? I mean, maybe, yes, countries have, and planners and policymakers have decided that it probably isn't worth the investment in all of these basic issues, and they can maybe make progress with working on a very narrow focus and just getting the development and economic gains out of investment in technology, industry, etc. But the fact is, it's not the case. If you look at where the media now focuses on, the insurgency in the north of Pakistan, the whole
media, ours or yours?
Global media, both. I mean, let's talk about where the conflict in my country has absolutely paralyzed progress the last couple of years. The northwest frontier, FATA, the areas where I come from and work, rural parts of Balochistan, same with southern Afghanistan. And you ask yourself, why is it that we are seeing this huge social uprising, which principally isn't a limited insurgency by just some people parachuting into that area? It's a massive uprising of the young people, largely young people, from those areas. Now, on a very simple analysis, you could say these are children of war. These are orphans who grew up during the earlier Afghan conflict, who have very little in terms of ties, and therefore they are very easily swayed by events around them. But that's very perfunctory. The reality is these are the very areas of the region where there has been almost no investment in human development. These are the areas which have been outside of the benefits of progress, where the trickle down that people felt out of growth rates and economies hasn't taken place. And it's not just the case within Pakistan only. If you look at the entire region, you find that the Jharkhand, the other part, Assam, there are very many areas of the region in India where you've got a similar circumstance, where insurgency, conflict has grown out of being social outcasts out of the development network. So I do believe that a lack of investment in human capital, social development, leads to a price that people have to pay. So that brings me to my final point. And the final point is there a message in this where science, diplomacy, and development could perhaps come together? And the answer to that is possibly and more likely yes. Now, as Jerry said, we have tried over the last 15, 20 years to try and bring people together, governments together, around issues of, shouldn't we be talking science, and maybe we can then find some common ground for our governments and nations to come together. And while that's a noble idea, it's frequently thwarted by this huge chasm between desire and action, good words and implementation. Because governments are typically paralyzed by their policy imperative, by other considerations, and also by their tenure. Governments in my region disappear within a couple of years. Even dictatorships disappear, and democracy is always very fragile. So the answer perhaps is in approaches that can transcend not only boundaries but governments, and bring institutions and people together, which have greater permanence. A lot of collaboration is built around human contexts, empathy for the same problems, issues. And collaboration is generally built not on a time frame of a few months, a year or two, but on a much longer time frame. So I feel, and I hope that will emerge from our discussions today, that some of these very challenges that I pointed out to you in health, nutrition, and development are challenges which are common to people and populations across boundaries. The nuances may vary, the severity or the extent of the problem, the urgency in some circumstances may be different, but the fundamentals are the same. And if the fundamentals are the same, then whether you live in one of the villages of Kandahar, or one of the villages of Sawat, or southern Punjab, or parts of Rajasthan, or Assam, or northern Bangladesh, then some of the values, the issues, the challenges are the same. And if they are, then maybe there is a solution to some of these by bringing people on the same platform, discussing common issues and solutions to some of those issues that may emerge from science. So thank you very much, Jerry. I think that is probably a mouthful as an introduction.
Thank you, Zulfiqar. I'd like to turn to Ambassador Harry Barnes, and maybe asking the question, is diplomacy the problem, or is it a solution? You can address that if you want, otherwise just ignore it.
Glad to address it within the limits of brevity. You told me earlier to be brief.
Right.
Fortunately, Zulfi has touched on a number of subjects which are relevant to diplomacy. Or let me put it this way, there are topics with which diplomats ought to be involved, may not always be, but need to be involved. There are two thoughts or 2 points I might make at the beginning. Diplomacy requires perseverance. Diplomacy requires patience. They sound rather similar. I'd make this distinction, though. Patience involves a certain amount, if not of suffering, at least an ability to wait and wait and wait. Perseverance involves waiting, but it is a more active type of waiting, that is pushing the boundaries, trying to reach solutions. If you are an effective diplomat, or if you can be an effective diplomat, then you've got to know when patience is called for, when perseverance is called for, when a mixture of the two is called for. Jerry's referred to my interest in science. I don't know whether historically this is correct, but let me give you my explanation of why. I went to a school which in its senior year offered a science course. I didn't know anything about science, and I thought I might learn something. I also happened to work on the school newspaper, and one day, not long before exam time, I was going through the drawers of the school newspaper desk when I came across the exam that was being proposed for the science course that particular time. And I couldn't decide whether to ignore that I had seen it or whether I had to realize that I had seen it and therefore had to deal with that. I did the latter. The only trouble was my memory was faulty and I didn't score well on the science course. Sort of almost instant retribution.
So you went into diplomacy.
No, what attracted me to diplomacy, Jerry, was, shall I say, the intrinsic difficulty, intrinsic problem of trying to be a diplomat. In an older and still valid perception, being a diplomat means being nice and kind and thoughtful, almost like Scout's oath, except there was a thread that was attributed to diplomats that they, or if the comment is accurate, people who were sent abroad to lie for the good of their country. Let me then switch to one other point. Part of being a good diplomat is being able to catch nuances, being able to understand questions that are complex and find your way through that. But above all, it requires sensitivity to the world around you in the broadest sense, both the world as world, but also your world where you're involved yourself. Let me give you an example from my time at the Carter Center. You may remember that Jimmy Carter went to North Korea, and out of that visit came what at that point appeared to be a significant breakthrough in the relationship or non-relationship between the U.S. and North Korea. What he decided in determining that he would make the trip, and he made the trip with some reluctance on the part of the then U.S. administration, what he decided was that the then leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, would probably respond, if he responded to anything, to being treated as if he were a real head of state. One could argue then, and one can argue now in the North Korean situation, that these are dictators, mean, difficult people, and so on. Carter was aware of that, well aware of it, but he figured that if he attempted to see Kim Il-sung and treated him seriously, that would make a difference, and it did. Question for people who follow up in a situation of that sort can be rather diverse and not necessarily as successful. You will have seen, certainly off and on the last couple months, renewed tensions between North Korea and just about the rest of the world. And the position being taken by the other countries who are negotiating or have been negotiating with North Korea has been that certain conditions have to be fulfilled before the other 5 countries will be prepared to reach any understanding with North Korea. They finally narrowed those conditions down to about five items, but could not get unanimity on whether to include the question of Japanese abductees, people whom Japanese feel have been taken from Japan and imprisoned and kept in prison in North Carolina. From the perspective that I was talking about a moment or so ago, from the Carter's perspective, not that he took part in this immediate phase, but from that perspective, insisting on the particular Japanese connection, however important and understandable that was in effect a guarantee that the talks would not succeed. And without overdoing my example, I think one could go back to that decision and explain a lot of what has happened and is still happening now in North Korea. Diplomats then need to be sensitive. Diplomats need to try to understand people who are difficult to understand, if not impossible to understand. And above all, to maintain a sense of, well, I would say perhaps anything is possible or anything ought to be possible, coupled with a willingness to listen to diverse points of view and realize that you don't have all the answers. You may not be able to get all the answers, but there's some others that might. Let me finish by explaining why, aside from my poor grade in science, I've gotten interested in science under the present conditions. In part, it's attributable to associating with people like Zulfi, whom I dropped in one day in his office in Karachi, or Patricia, who has kept me in touch with the National Academy of Sciences. But it's also a conviction that a diplomat has to have a real sense of the world around them, and that world has to include science. If you don't include science, you miss, I'm not sure I can give a mathematical quotation, but you're going to miss a lot, and I've been determined not to miss any more than I had to. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Harry. Patricia.
Jared, I want to thank you very much for inviting me today, and Harry in particular for thinking of me. And I've always wondered why Harry kept me around, because I'm definitely one of his failures. In fact, that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about today. But now I know that I'm just one of many. So I feel much better, I guess. But I have to, I've been at the Academies now for almost 9 years. And I'm not going to say what it is. If any of you want to know, we can talk about it later. But we get to work with some really cool people, and some people who are very important, some people who are very self-important, you know, you know, both Nobel Prize winners and Nobel wannabes. And but I have to admit, you know, I mean, one can get a little jaded, but one of the really fabulous things about working at the Academies is meeting true citizens who have so much to offer and who give so much. And so for me, one of the best things that ever happened to me was getting to meet Harry, who has dragged me along all these years, who has taught me so much about trying to be diplomatic, which isn't so easy because I'm so blunt, and who never gives up. And that's why I'm here today. I was kind of asked to talk about the hurdles of creating science cooperation. So I'm kind of sorry that we're ending with me, because my story is going to be a little bit of a downer, and I don't think that's where we should end. I think where we should really end is where we began, because I think what Zulfi, where he wants to go, is exactly what we should be talking about. But I am going to talk about an experience that kind of didn't go exactly the way we hoped it would. And it started with a great idea of Harry's, and I've known Harry since 2002. And he came to me, we were actually in Goa in a meeting of Indo-US cooperation on the war against terrorism, or whatever it was called, something like that, in Goa, of all places. Very cool.
Very peaceful.
Very peaceful. In 2002, and Harry said to me, last summer, so this was August of 2003, he had met with Anwar Nasim of Pakistan and MS Swaminathan of India at a meeting in the Maldives. Is that right? Maldives. And he approached them about the possibility of doing some kind of tripartite project with the United States on something having to do with agri-biotech. And they said, oh, that's a great idea. So Harry said, do you think the academies would be interested? I said, we would love to do it. And then we got Roger Beachy involved we spoke to many people. Roger Beachy is the outgoing founding president of the Danforth Plant Science Center in St. Louis, Missouri. And we had discussions with Swaminathan, Nasim, and we had a first meeting in Lahore in May of 2005. And by the way, this was my second trip to Pakistan. My first trip to Pakistan was actually my very first trip to Asia that took place in 2002. And as Jerry said in his introduction of me, I direct the Committee on Scientific Communication and National Security. And my first trip there was on U.S.-Pakistani security relations. But the work that I have done on Pakistan and in South Asia more generally in the academies, particularly recently, is within the unit called Development, Security, and Cooperation. So, and the security is a soft, a little s, or soft security, as far as my engagement with Pakistan and also India goes. Anyhow, we have this meeting in Lahore in May of 2005. There are approximately, I think, 6 or 8 Pakistanis, 6 Indians, and 3 Americans. And we meet at a round table for dinner, our very first night, which was perfect. And Swaminathan said to me, so how do you want people to sit? And I said, nobody can sit next to someone from their home country, and that was the only rule. And it was really a marvelous dinner, and a lot of the Indians there had actually been born in Pakistan, and this was the first time they were back, and some were actually natives of Lahore, and this was the first time they were back since 1947, and it was extremely poignant to be able to listen to these people talking to each other. And the average age was people in their probably 60s and 70s, I would say at that time. And all of these people had roles in some area of agricultural biotechnology, and what we wanted to do was develop some kind of tripartite project. And we had a second meeting planned for Delhi in March of 2006, so that's 10 months later. We show up in Delhi only to get a note saying, oh, by the way, the Pakistanis aren't coming. So the Indians and the Americans met for a couple of days, and the
Indians closed the border, or the Pakistanis?
No, well, to be honest, we never quite knew why the Pakistanis didn't come. And we were more than willing to say, oh, those Indians, they wouldn't give them visas, and it's really their fault. But when the Pakistanis called, when our point of contact called me and apologized, I knew that wasn't really the problem. So it turns out that there were other issues going on that we never really exactly knew. But it was also a holiday. I mean, there were all kinds of issues, but I think the bottom line was that the Pakistani government did not want them to leave, which we later understood why, but we did not at the time. But even the very first meeting in Lahore in May of 2005, I remember when the Indian representatives were talking about the resources that they had in India, I just was sitting there cringing because it was this, they were being peacocks, and I don't know how many of you have ever been to Pakistan, but they're peacocks in a lot of places, so it's really cool. But they were so preening, and it's like, come on, folks, we're really here to try and figure out how to work together, not for you to make your hosts feel lesser. So it wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible. And in fact, after they all went to Faisalabad together, and from what I understand, we're all singing songs together, and actually it was a good trip. But we never gelled. And then the Pakistanis didn't show up, weren't able to come in 2006, and then we had one last meeting planned for August 2006, and at the last minute the one Pakistani representative called and said, "I'm so sorry, I can't come." And at that point it just completely fell apart, and it fell apart not only, well, there are three reasons. One was, this was right around the time that the Americans and the Indians were working at the nuclear contract and the nuclear treaty. And the Pakistanis were understandably furious. And so that did not go down well. It was also within a short time frame of the Mumbai bombings, and that was problematic. And the third reason, which no one had actually told us, was that in fact biotech was considered a national security issue in Pakistan. And they were never going to let us do anything. But we did not know that for the first 10 months of the project. Both the Pakistani interlocutors and the Indians came to Harry and me and said, we really want to do this bilaterally. Could we kind of start out bilaterally and maybe turn this into a trilateral project? And in fact, Swaminathan said, let's bring in everybody in the region. So we're getting the very strong message. This trilateral project is not going to go anywhere. And then it had a rebirth about a year later with a former Home Secretary of the National Academy of Sciences, this is Steve Berry, who wanted to do something on Pakistan. And what we decided was that we would no longer try and have a trilateral project, but that we would do something bilateral that was not security related with the Pakistanis. And one thing that was very clear to us is that we had a lot of fences to mend, that Pakistan-U.S. relations...
Bilateral India-Pakistan or India-U.S. or U.S.-Pakistan?
Just U.S.-Pakistan. That U.S.-Pakistani relations were terrible, that there was so much distrust by the Pakistanis of Americans and so much ignorance by the Americans of Pakistan. We decided that what we really needed to do was kind of, what was that button that Hillary Clinton was trying to push, when she went to, the restart button, the reset button when she went to Russia. So we were trying to kind of reset relations. And this time the topic was going to be water, but not water in the Indus Valley. We really wanted to stay away from security issues, and that's how I got to meet Jim Westcoat, which has been such a, I'm so delighted to have helped bring about this new set of relationships. So we wrote a proposal, and so the new proposal was called Exploring Institution Building in Pakistan. And we went to Plowshares, who had an initial interest. Well, Plowshares, you can imagine, is a peace-related foundation. And after we spend a fair amount of time writing this proposal, they come back and say, well, we're really only doing national security issues now, and you're too soft security. And that's kind of where we are right now. So the bottom line, unfortunately, is money. And it has been a huge surprise to me that given where things are right now, that it is so difficult to raise funds to do non-directly security-related projects because, in fact, there's such a great need to start to build a whole new set of relationships between Pakistan and the United States. And maybe I'll just end with something that Zulfi said at the end of his talk, which is the purpose of our new project was precisely to get beyond governments, because we felt that the distrust was largely between governments and not among people. and that what we have been trying to do is to develop new relationships in Pakistan and hopefully at some point raise new funds so that we can get something going. And perseverance, I've learned my lesson.
And patience.
And patience, yes.
So one of the things that might be interesting in the conversation is if there are times when the National Academies of Science, with its component parts, can't serve that neutral broker role and can't get the resources, can the universities do that? And we don't mean to restrict this discussion to South Asia. You know, this is open for people's perspectives from wherever they come. I just point out Dr. Ali Ardalan is here from University of Tehran and is a public health expert. And we've had some conversations with him and colleagues at BU about where Iran is and where Iran is going and what are the connections and where do universities play a critical role in getting past those kinds of barriers. So this is open for commentary, challenge. Hani.
Andy Martin from the medical campus, and I'll apologize. Excuse me. And I'll apologize in advance to the speakers because I have to take my colleague Dr. Ardalan to the airport shortly. But I did want to get a question in before we go about your perspectives on health diplomacy. I'm a big believer, perhaps a naive one, in health diplomacy, but it seems that it matters a lot how one defines those two terms coming together, and whether one is just using health quickly to advance some other diplomatic goal, or whether one states that health diplomacy, you know, even at a very low level but sustained over a long period of time, is used to build goodwill so that you can actually engage on more complicated issues. And you know, previously, you know, growing up, one would think of health diplomacy as almost the Peace Corps model, where, you know, lots of young people that are eager and go spend years in some country and actually probably then have that relationship going forward for many years to come, versus some of these, you know, one-off, bilateral, trilateral, what have you, experiments. And I wanted to know from any of you what you think the future is to develop not just momentum, but funding and strategies for low-level, long-term, sustained commitments that can weather the kind of ups and downs of you know, the vicissitudes of national security relationships.
Well, do you want to go ahead? And I can take a crack at this. I think that's a very important question. And to my, again, relatively naive understanding, I think if health diplomacy was to have a benefit, it, at the first instance, has to target people and not just short-term governments. I think in the context of the region that we focused on a little bit, South Asia per se, unless you're able to engage people and institutions in subjects, topic areas which are important, not so narrowly focused that they miss the major part of the attributable fraction of whatever is it that you're dealing with, and you're able to do that over a period of time, you're not going to develop the critical mass around people working together on issues, determining through that process that many of the problems and indeed the solutions are similar, and they require a degree of collaboration, cooperation across borders and boundaries. That is what is the first step in building a nexus towards people recognizing that differences can be put aside, differences can be postponed in terms of their resolution, but people-to-people contact and development can still continue. So I think it's extremely important in the context of health diplomacy to try and see, firstly, completely supporting what Patricia said, we need to go beyond governments and we need to go beyond government constraints. And fortunately, in the region, there is a public sector, but there's also an independent non-public sector, which is reasonably strong and in fact, maybe even stronger in terms of its scientific depth and its relation to some of those issues than governments per se. Also, you don't run the risk of working with individuals who will disappear just because their tenure or offices come to an end. And thirdly, because they usually have greater convening power and flexibility in terms of visas and permissions and being able to go and cross boundaries or meet elsewhere than typically public sector government servants do. So I think just being very pragmatic, in the context of maternal child health and nutrition, I especially think that the entire region, to a certain extent, even inclusive of not just South Asia, but Central Asian states, this is a unique opportunity of getting people together to work out common issues, which are actually of fundamental security value. I have occasionally failed to convince people how important these fundamental things are from a long-term security perspective, actually. And that's not immediately apparent to people, but it is fundamentally important. If you have an undernourished population, a child mortality rate, a maternal mortality rate as high as this, I mean, it is going to feed to insecurity in that region and social deprivation. So I don't know whether you want to add to that or...
I'd add only that I would be, what's the right word, expedient perhaps. I take advantage of opportunities while they last. And if someone in government is able to be helpful, I would try to get help from that person in government who can be helpful. They may disappear a year from now, but what you can do in a year may be worth it.
Just a couple of thoughts. I really think that question is really central, and I can't approach it from a health perspective. But from the experience that I've had, one of the things that's become very clear to at least some of us is the extent to which people's view of America has really changed over the last 8 years, and that it, and I'm not saying this to be a knee-jerk Democrat, because it's fairly well thought that the Bush administration or the former administration did so much to hurt America's role in the world that that there is very little trust. And I don't, I'm trying to think if I used the word trust or if any of us did. But the truth of the matter is there is just a huge trust deficit, if you will, between the United States and many countries in the world, especially those that are trying to develop themselves. There is so little confidence that when when the United States gets involved, that we're actually doing it because it's the right thing to do, rather than self-serving, and particularly in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Pakistanis who have watched this relationship for 20, 30, 40 years see it as so unequal, as so exploitative, if you will. Whether or not this is completely deserved, I'm not even going to go there. But these are the realities on the ground, and when these are the realities, what do you do to start to work through the distrust that has really gotten so crusty that we can't see each other anymore?
One brief comment, and then, Ali, I wonder if before you leave you might want to say something about the regional issues. But the comment that I have is that I served in the U.S. government for 5 years at the National Institutes of Health in a leadership position, 3 of them in the Bush administration. So it went from good to bad. And precisely the way that you're describing the relationships between science representing the U.S. government in many countries, our reputation was terrible. There was no trust. But on an individual level, and on the level of connection with Americans as opposed to the American government, that went on. People had relationships that they could trust and believe in, and then figure out the political constraints will change, and then we can move forward. Let's not lose the connection. And I think that's very important, and it speaks to persistence in relationships. No matter how tough things are going, when the U.S. government says we can't say certain things about stem cell research or issues like that, you have to get past it. First of all, you have your private views, which you can express. You're still a citizen, and as long as they don't know about it, whoever they is. But it's that persistence in relationships that's so critical. And at some level, that is the key diplomacy that we need to pursue. Ali, I don't know if you wanted to say something about your own sense of the region, coming from a country that has lots of problems and has lots of expertise and talent.
First, thank you for this opportunity, having me in this, prestigious meeting. Serving the people needs a lot of patience and needs to be diplomat, but not necessarily using the term of diplomacy, even combined with the health diplomacy, because anyway governments think that is blind to them, like politics. So I need to be a diplomat, but not necessarily is the word. Regarding starting the collaboration, and continue the collaboration, I have a little experience working about 5 years with the Pittsburgh University of Pittsburgh with the super course, and linking with many Americans, people in CDC at Emory University, other college and institutions, but very safely with some publication and something like that. Maybe the first and the easiest solution that maybe come to mind is signing an MOU, having a project with a large funds with a lot of propaganda. But I'm not sure that is at the moment with this kind of political dispute that exists that works well. So just what we need and request from the diplomats is to keep the channels open. Maybe the kind of sanction is related and works for even the intellectual transfer, even bringing a laptop, even talking to each other. So, but if we keep the channels open for a long term, I think it would be benefit of the both communities. Thank you.
Jeff.
I'm Deborah Main from the School of Public Health. I was just thinking that there's a very interesting elephant in this room, and that is the relationship between Zulfi and John and Jerry, which was largely built on U.S. government money, right? USAID projects. 20 years, and the persistence that's gone into this relationship. And it's interesting because we're talking about failures, and yet I'm looking at this persistent success.
Can I comment to that?
Please.
Just wait, take the microphone.
I agree with, I don't know if I'm an elephant or not, but
You're a donkey.
What I don't agree with is the notion that the relationship was built on USAID development assistance dollars. And the story, what's that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it wasn't.
What's the word? Wasn't it the USAID projects you worked on?
That created the opportunity,
Exactly.
but I'm gonna tell a story because I think the statute of limitations is up, so I think I can get away with telling this story. Development assistance dollars created the opportunity for two young scientists at a hungry stage of their career, correct me when I misspeak, Zulfi, right? Two young scientists at a hungry stage of their career who had common interests to find each other. What we did with it actually had very little to do, in my opinion, with U.S. development assistance dollars. So catalytic or opportunistic, or I think Harry's comment was take advantage of the opportunities or the windows when they exist. Deb, I think you're absolutely right. That's what the U.S. development assistance dollars did. And if you were to predict that, a Jewish boy from Cleveland Heights and a Muslim guy from Peshawar were going to have a 24-year long-term collaborative relationship where he becomes Uncle Zulfi to my children, in addition to the scientific collaborations, probably not, okay? But I do believe that it is the commitment to common ideals and values and common questions in science, which has actually sustained us through 9 projects, not the existence of development assistance dollars per se. Quick story, Zulfi, and then I'll give you the... part of the difficulty in U.S.-Pakistan relations has been the inconsistency in the U.S. development assistance flows. When we're fighting a proxy war against the Russians in Afghanistan, Pakistan was awash with U.S. development assistance dollars. When the Afghanis threw the Russians out, we cut off aid, and we used the Bolin Amendment. We knew they had nukes the whole time, but all of a sudden, oh my God, we found that they have the triggers on the same air bases, they have the weapon systems. We cut off U.S.-Pakistani assistance right in the middle of some projects. What we did was we went to our colleagues at WHO and said, we can't spend US dollars in Pakistan anymore, but we want to keep this relationship going. So we'll take your project in Vietnam. If you'll take your Vietnam project money and give it to Zulfi. Remember this deal, Zulfi?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we sustained a collaborative research relationship for 4 years.
Yep.
Without ever actually touching hands or passing monies. And in this case, it was a colleague at WHO who served as the broker. And this is the true honor among thieves comment, I think, that because the relationship and the questions that we were trying to answer were deemed to be much more important than the diplomatic position of the United States and its inconsistency through time, we sustained a relationship, and we would meet in third countries, and we went through some rough times where there was no money, which I think made it easier to pick it up when we decided to go back to war in the region, and Pakistan's now awash in money again. So,
I mean, if I can, John, with your permission, if I can be very specific, I think there's no question that resources make it easier for people to come together. But I think it's oversimplistic to imagine that that drives stable relationships. And as John's pointed out, I think one key element in some successes, and also a factor in other failures, has been the fact that sometimes people, individuals, scientists, public health people, will meet on common grounds, see some common vision, and then agree to work together, whether or not the dollars flowed or stopped. And as John has just told you, when U.S. assistance was cut off, it was cut off kind of midstream, with many projects having had to be abandoned after being launched. Some were truly abandoned, and others we had to find inventive ways of putting our own resources on the table and come forward. But that's what I meant by using this opportunity that we have of a huge morass of problems, some of which are common to the region. But using an inventive approach of maybe bringing science academies, scientists, public health people, universities together to work on common issues. And even if we were successful 30% of the time, just look at what that 30% could do. Here is, you've taken an example of a friendship that I'm so proud of, which has lasted, 2 decades and a half. Imagine if 30 scientists out of 100 in the region, both with United States and not even including United States for a few times, 30 scientists between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, they could develop working relationships. What contribution could that do to civic society out there? Yesterday in our discussions, I actually thought about this, Jim, for a long time afterwards. John and I have been working with Jerry and other colleagues on childhood diarrhea for well over 2.5 decades. Although, our interests may have diversified, but it's still a very common issue. We talk about a disorder that still kills about 1.5 million children globally every year. The diarrhea mortality rates in the region, not just Pakistan, but in the entire region, still stuck at about 1/4 of all post-neonatal child deaths. Yet if you look at how much has been done systematically to address this issue from a public health science perspective, improving urban water, sanitation, hygiene, those kind of interventions, I could write the entire list of interventions maybe on, one postage stamp, because there has been virtually nothing. And that's also a failure of linkage with the right people, or picking up the questions in a way that you could make some systematic inroads into this. So one opportunity that science platforms can offer is bringing people with diverse disciplines and experiences together, and bringing them together in a way that you could complement strengths, frequently strengths across borders. So, you know, if you have Swaminathan in India, who's a global expert in agriculture, that you could complement that with something else from this side. And again, that develops into a very cogent political force. Just to finish, I have seen this happen in disciplines outside of public health or pure science. I've seen this happen in the human rights arena. Today, in the region, if you talk about fundamental human rights, gender issues, issues related to violence, issues related to, you know, gender equity, people will rattle off names very quickly which have no nationalities attached to it, but they are global experts. So Arundhati Roy comes to Pakistan as welcomed as an absolute heroine. And similarly, you know, Asma Jahangir can go to India and be similarly acclaimed. Why is it that that group of people are able to transcend boundaries and limitations, and public health scientists or scientists cannot? I mean, there's got to be maybe a lesson in what they have done right, and I believe that the lesson in there is that they have reached out to the masses. So they are not owned by institutions, organizations, or governments. They work in terms of their linkage with people, civic society at large.
Jeff, and then Adil.
It's been a great conversation, and what's on my mind is to pick up on Jerry's question about the role of universities, and the point then that Zulfi, you also mentioned here, is that it seems there's a fundamental research question about the performance of multi-track diplomacy models of different types and structures. And I wondered, Harry, this is a question for you, whether people like John MacDonald's model of multi-track diplomacy has been subject to really rigorous scientific evaluation to see what the performance records is for different types of multi-track efforts, and particularly those involving universities, because we just hear what the examples of Asma Jahangir and Arundhati Roy, that affiliation with the university was not a component there. On the other hand, if you're trying to mobilize diverse research expertise and cross academic boundaries, it might be the university-to-university model would be an ideal mode of engagement. So I'm curious as to whether the university has both a special role and mission here to play if there is a rigorous research on the performance of universities. And the last point is that is to underscore the importance in the 21st century of return flows of knowledge to the U.S., because we have water and poverty and sanitation problems in the U.S. That Native American reservations rival those of Karachi and Mumbai. And we still have, when we have great successes as well. So it seems like to address some of these problems in the U.S. in the 21st century, searching internationally and having the types of engagement you've described are going to be crucial. But my core question is, what role do you envision for university-to-university collaboration? Thanks.
I kind of like the way your former provost and our president at BU is trying to look at what the university's connections and reach and performance and its global activities. We are a business. The business is education. The business is generating knowledge, transmitting knowledge, using knowledge. And we live in a century of a globalized world. As you know, you just did it the other day. 12 hours you can get from India to here, maybe a little longer if you were on a U.S. airline. And the best thing that we can possibly do for our core business, which is education, is to introduce our students to the rest of the world. So they not only know the geography, but they know the culture, the history, the politics. Science is a really good avenue to make those kinds of connections, because there are problems that we are interested in that are relevant to our society, but for one reason or another, can be researched better outside of the U.S. And maybe concentration of a patient population or an epidemiological situation. We don't have transmitting malaria here, but we have lots of people who go to malaria endemic areas. And that gives us an opportunity to do what we do best as the cornerstone of the relationship. And as long as the assumption is that you're in a partnership, and the partnership means that there's a bilateral flow of information, you share information, you have access to information, you own the information together, you decide what to do with it together. I think it actually works. And the issue around the government and the constraints that the government puts on, you have to find a good diplomat like Harry, who, and maybe I can redefine what diplomacy is from the definitions that you offered. It's actually trying to figure out what's going on underneath the posturing. And the posturing is on both sides. And so there are often missed signals because you don't understand what's underlying. And somebody who gets embedded in the region, who's a good diplomat, who understands what's going on, who sees the cross-border stuff, he may tell you, look, the administration isn't going to go for it because this is why, but here's where you can find that open window. And that sort of a connection, I think, is maybe less direct than what the term science diplomacy tends to imply, but nonetheless extremely valuable. And I strongly believe that universities are at the leading edge of trying to do that.
Jerry, has BU ever had a diplomat in residence?
Yes, Adil.
Maybe my colleague here can tell us well, we have Ambassador Dunbar, who is a career FSO, and he's been teaching here, I'd say, for the last eight years. Ambassador Lyons, and Ambassador Dunbar was ambassador in Yemen, had a couple of tours. I think he was the DCM in Kabul. We've also had CIA officers in residence, including myself and Art Hulnick. So I think the Department of International Relations has always been very good in that regard.
Maybe I can add at that, following both from John's comment and yours, which was maybe not on the role of the university, but I think John got it exactly right, that both the sort of hungry part of your career, I think, is extremely important. I really do think it's but I do think it's extremely important, but there has to be a scientific question that drives it. If there isn't the scientific passion, I will take your money. I won't refuse it, but I'm not going anywhere with it. And if it is there, then if I don't have your money, I will find it somewhere else. My own sense is there's plenty of money around. But the scientific passion you have to lead from, and that goes to what Jeff was saying. So I was thinking, listening to this, where has such cooperation happened before, where you wouldn't have expected? So one example which some people in the room would know is IASA in Vienna, which was Soviet and the US. And it's a scientific institute, didn't come out of a university, but came out of university people, and very consciously set up. And for many years, the only place where scientists from the two blocks would meet in Vienna was a convenient place. Second example that I thought of was North and South Korea, which are very interesting and somewhat a good analogy to our region, in that South Korea is, of course, a major scientific player in its own league. North Korea is usually not thought of to be one, but in certain areas, long-range missiles, is actually very advanced technologically. Now, those happen to be areas that are of interest to an authoritarian regime and so on and so forth, and multiple efforts have been made and have failed by South Korean universities to link up with North Korean ones, for example, on agriculture, because you also have to look at where the locus of scientific expertise is, and that wasn't matching. But not to make this too long, but I was thinking India, Pakistan, or South Asia, and where has real meaningful scientific cooperation happened? The example I could think of was the Green Revolution, which I'm not a fan of,
But IRI, the International Institute for Rice Institute, International
Yeah, Rice
Rice
Institute.
Research Institute, actually created very real, very deep, very serious scientific cooperation because there was a topic for agricultural scientists, Swaminathan at that point included, to really get excited about it. So choosing that topic, I think, is central. Let me end by throwing one potential topic, and this will not come as a surprise to anyone who knows me, which is climate change. Here are two countries for whom the glacial melt is an existential question. Here are two countries, peacocks or not, who cannot really understand it fully, simply by way of geography and science. Here is an issue that actually is attracting a lot of money, and so I would add it to your list, Zulfi, along with public health and especially child-related issues as one potential area where the things might be ripe.
I agree.
John.
And add the challenge of creating livable cities,
Right.
which is related to climate change but separate. I think the urbanization dynamic and agenda is in fact so real for India, so real for Pakistan, and such an important, there's such a demographic shift and the rate of acceleration of change to urbanized populations creates tremendous challenges, and therefore for university communities, I think tremendous opportunities to try and work on the applied problems associated with creating livable cities or sustaining livable cities.
You can actually link all three together because there are implications, especially given recent events over the last few years. So the issue of climate change in the region in a longer time track, what does it do for water security in the short and intermediate term, and how does that link to where 50% of the population is now living is your large mega cities, and how does this impact mega cities? I mean, I've been away and I know that my city was flooded. I mean, my office had 1.5 foot of water the last 3-4 days. Why? Because the capacity, sorry? Yeah, well, the capacity of many of these cities to, number one, tackle water scarcity or access is extremely limited. I mean, Mumbai gets flooded every time there's a deluge. Karachi gets flooded every time there's a deluge, and both cities are water scarce. So I think there is perhaps an opportunity of linking some of these mega issues, but bringing them also closer to some items or outputs which would have a more direct impact on livelihoods as we speak.
Any comments from folks who have not yet had a chance to say anything they want to? No? Any last comments? Pat? Patricia?
I was going to be really pessimistic.
Next.
You're completely right. There is no question that there's a will. I think not so much a way right now. I'm not sure I agree that there's as much money as you think there is, but But I actually think that the politics desperately get in the way. And on the one hand, I really wouldn't want a political scientist to run the world, but I also wouldn't want a scientist, a natural scientist to run the world. And some of the relationships that I've had with natural and physical scientists since I've been at the academies is this very strong cause and effect relationship that doesn't really take politics into account. And so there's this real surprise about, well, why isn't this working? And the answer, unfortunately, is politics. And one of the things that we were talking about before is I'm a political scientist, but I don't think that political science really exists. I call it political arts because I think that's the best we ever get. And that, to me, is part of the problem. That I think that, for one thing, people who think they understand politics aren't so good at talking to people who do understand scientists and vice versa. And I think even those relationships need to improve to figure out more successful and sustained ways of doing exactly what you're saying.
I mean, I call political science a science. I mean, it's an extremely important area, And you know, I think engaging governments in a meaningful way, something that we call our research to policy track. How do you present scientific findings in a way that you can impact on policy is also a science, not an art, actually. In our discipline, certainly in our maternal child health, etc., that's where we spend a lot of our dollars and effort in trying to package findings in a way that it will influence policy. So you're absolutely right, but I mean, I would put them as part of the science realm.
Once we can get to a point of true interdisciplinarity, I think we'll make some progress. And however pessimistic you say you are, you're really not all that pessimistic. Because there is progress. It doesn't happen with warp speed, but it does happen. And with the persistence and patience and the ability to interact with and communicate with people who come from different perspectives, like many of the activities I do at the academies, with a view to sustainability, of how do you try to ensure sustainability, which is at the first root financial, but then it's the relationships. I think we're heading in the right direction again, and that's hopeful. So thank you all.